Okay, so you want to own a dry cleaner. You picture a small storefront on a corner with decent foot traffic, a revolving rack of plastic-wrapped shirts turning behind the counter, a bell on the door, a regular customer base of suits, uniforms, and wedding dresses. Maybe a second location someday, then a third. It feels like the kind of business America was quietly built on: low-tech, cash-flowing, recession-resistant. People will always need clean clothes. Nobody disrupts a pressing machine. Here's the number that should stop you before you sign a lease. There are roughly 28,000 dry cleaners operating in the United States right now. And in December 2024, the EPA finalized a rule that bans the one chemical almost every single one of them has depended on since the 1960s. Not restricts, bans. A 10-year countdown, already running, on the solvent this entire industry was quietly built on top of. That little paper tag stapled to your shirt collar when you pick up your clothes, the one you never bother to read, the one that just tells the counter clerk which rack your order is hanging on, is about to become one of the most expensive pieces of paper in American small business. By the time this countdown ends, some of today's 28,000 shops won't exist. Not because customers stopped wanting clean clothes, because the chemistry underneath the counter changed, and not everyone can afford to change with it. This industry has always marketed itself as the definition of stable, a business that survives recessions because dirty clothes never go out of style. What it doesn't advertise is a regulatory clock that's been ticking since the 1990s, a liability question buried under almost every older building in the country, and a legal exposure so large that one single customer complaint has, on at least one well-documented occasion, been enough to end a business that a court later ruled did absolutely nothing wrong. Let's start with what this industry actually looks like, because it is not what you think it is. You are not picturing an industry. You are picturing one storefront. In reality, the U.S. dry cleaning sector generates somewhere around $9.6 to $9.8 billion a year. And it is shrinking in exactly the metric that matters most, the number of shops. Roughly 28,000 businesses in 2024. Down again in 2025 to somewhere near 25,000 to 27,000, depending on whose count you trust. A decline of about 1 to 3% a year, every year, for the last 5 years running. Meanwhile, total revenue has crept upward over that same stretch. Read that combination carefully. Fewer shops, more total revenue. That means the businesses that survive are either getting bigger individually, or the same volume of garments is consolidating into fewer and fewer hands. Some of that decline isn't mysterious. Business casual killed a chunk of it. Fewer suits, fewer ties, fewer trips to the counter on a Monday morning. Synthetic, machine-washable fabrics killed another chunk. At-home dry cleaning kits took a slice too. And 35,000-plus coin laundromats across the country now compete directly for the same customer who used to default to the dry cleaner out of habit. This is not one industry. It is two, wearing the same apron. The first is the corner shop, a husband, a wife, one processing plant, maybe 2 employees, open since the late 1990s, doing somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000 a year in revenue. This is still the overwhelming majority of the 28,000. Most of them have never been part of a franchise system in their life. The second is the franchise system. Tide Cleaners, backed by the brand power of Procter & Gamble. Zips Dry Cleaners, backed by a private equity fund called JPB Capital Partners. These operate with real marketing budgets, centralized processing plants, flat-rate pricing models, and app-based pickup. And a single location can gross well over $1 million a year. Both of them hang the exact same paper tag on your shirt when you drop off your clothes. Only one of the two business models is actually built to survive what's coming next. There's a customer split hiding underneath all of this too. Residential drop-in traffic, the person bringing in one suit before a wedding, has been the slow-bleeding side of the business for 2 decades. Commercial accounts, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, uniformed staff, have quietly become the side that keeps a lot of these 28,000 shops solvent, because a contract with a hotel chain doesn't disappear just because business casual took over corporate America. None of that changes what's coming. A hotel doesn't care what solvent cleaned its linens. The EPA's phase-out doesn't check whether your revenue comes from a bride or a bellhop. It's worth putting the neighboring industry next to this one, because they get confused constantly. Laundromats, Coin-operated, self-service, no PERC anywhere near them. Number over 35,000 locations nationally and generate around $7 to $7.2 billion a year. They're not shrinking the way dry cleaners are. They don't carry a decades-long chemical liability question. A laundromat owner's biggest regulatory headache is a broken card reader. A dry cleaner's biggest regulatory headache might be sitting under the parking lot, undiscovered, gaining interest like a debt nobody's opened the statement for yet. So you want in. Let's build the real cost. In order, the way the money actually leaves your account before you've cleaned a single shirt. First, the plant itself. A standard drop-off-only location. No equipment on site. Just a counter and a delivery contract routing your garments to someone else's processing plant. Runs $184,000 to $330,000 if you're buying into a system like Zips. A full plant, with your own dry cleaning machines, your own boiler, your own pressing equipment, runs $730,000 to $1.3 million. Want the Procter & Gamble-backed brand instead? Tide Cleaners requires $1.1 million in liquid capital and a net worth of $2 million just to qualify to apply. Total investment, once you're approved, $682,000 to $1.6 million. Second layer, the franchise fee itself, typically around $30,000 upfront, plus a separate software license fee stacked on top. Then royalties, 6% of every dollar of revenue you bring in, for as long as you operate the store. Then marketing fees, another 5%, split between national, regional, and local funds you don't personally control the spending of. You haven't cleaned a single shirt yet, and you've already committed a fixed percentage of every future dollar of revenue to someone else's balance sheet. Third layer, and this is the one nobody puts in the glossy franchise brochure, environmental liability. Perchloroethylene, PERC, is the solvent that's been cleaning America's clothes since the 1960s. It's over 60% heavier than water. When it leaks, and after 60 years in an older building, it usually has, whether the current owner ever knew it or not. It doesn't float away harmlessly with the groundwater. It sinks. It pools at the bottom of the aquifer as a dense, separate layer that ordinary pump-and-treat remediation systems physically cannot reach. California regulators estimate that 75% of the state's 7,500 to 10,000 dry cleaners have caused a PERC contamination plume at some point in their history. Cleaning up a single site runs $1 to $10 million. Multiply that across the state's dry cleaning footprint, and you get a total cleanup liability of $7.5 billion to over $100 billion for one industry in one state alone. North Carolina built a cleanup fund from a per-gallon tax on solvent purchases, precisely to spread this cost across the industry instead of bankrupting individual owners. That fund once held $37.5 million. It's down to $5.6 million. The average certified site there still costs $330,000 to close out. There are 361 certified sites in the state still waiting in line. Oregon runs a similar program. 7 active cleanup sites remain there today, with an estimated combined closing cost of about $742,500, and that number keeps moving as investigations continue. Zoom into a single property, and the range gets even more specific. A basic Phase 1 environmental assessment costs about $2,000. A Phase 2, if the Phase 1 flags a concern, runs $15,000 to $20,000. If there's an immediate vapor threat to the building, mitigating it costs $5,000 to $30,000. But a full soil and groundwater remediation, the kind PERC's chemistry practically guarantees eventually, runs anywhere from $500,000 to $3 million, depending on whether the contamination has formed what specialists call NAPL, a dense, sunken pool of pure solvent sitting at the bottom of the aquifer, resistant to almost everything you can throw at it. You are not just buying a business. You are buying whatever every previous tenant in that building poured down a floor drain in 1987, and nobody wrote it down. Even before you get anywhere near a contamination question, the ordinary monthly overhead is its own quiet drain. Insurance premiums alone run $500 to $2,000 a month. Ad rent, utilities for a plant that runs boilers and heavy machinery all day, and staffing, and total average monthly operating costs land somewhere between $8,500 and $28,500, a range wide enough to swallow a slow month whole before you've paid for a single unit of solvent. And now factor in the ban itself. Converting an existing PERC machine to a non-chlorinated alternative, hydrocarbon systems, professional wet cleaning, liquid carbon dioxide, isn't a software update. It's new equipment, new ventilation, sometimes new plumbing, layered on top of every cost you just read. The EPA didn't set one deadline. It set several, stacked by equipment age. Machines bought after roughly 6 months from the rules publication can't use PERC at all. That market is closed already. Third-generation machines, the older mechanical design, still running in plenty of small shops, get 3 years. Fourth and fifth-generation machines, the newer, more sealed systems most shops upgraded to over the last 2 decades, get the full 10. Which means the owners with the oldest equipment, usually the smallest, least capitalized operators, are the ones facing the shortest runway to either finance new machinery or shut down. None of this comes with a subsidized loan program waiting at your local bank. Financing a plant conversion mid-lease, on top of an existing SBA loan for the original build-out, is its own negotiation. One, a franchise-backed operator with corporate support has a real structural advantage in having, compared to a husband and wife shop financing this alone. Here's where the money actually moves, once the doors are open and the equipment is running. A well-run independent dry cleaner nets somewhere between 10 and 20% profit margin, with the top performers pushing 25% or higher. On $250,000 in annual revenue, that's roughly $25,000 to $50,000 a year in real profit, before you've paid yourself an actual salary for the 50-plus hours a week you're standing behind that counter yourself. Solvent and supply costs eat a significant, volatile share of that margin. In some cost models, solvent alone runs as high as 60% of a plant's direct input costs, which means a single price spike from your chemical supplier can wipe out a slow month entirely. Labor is usually your single biggest fixed cost after that. Pressers, counter staff, a plant manager if you're big enough to need one, all paid whether garment volume is high or low that week. Now look at where the franchise money actually flows, because this is the part that explains the entire structure. The franchisor doesn't care whether your specific location has a good month or a bad one. They collect the 6% royalty and the 5% marketing fee on your gross revenue, not your profit. Whether your store cleared $40,000 in a slow month or $200,000 in a great one. The fee is calculated at the top of your income statement, before a single one of your expenses gets subtracted. That's the mechanism. Not because Tide Cleaners is secretly working against you. Not because Zips wants any individual franchisee to fail. Because the fee is structured on revenue, and revenue is the one number a franchisor can always verify, always audit, and always collect against, regardless of what solvent costs, labor shortages, or equipment breakdowns did to your actual bottom line that month. While you're absorbing chemical price spikes, staffing gaps, and machine repairs out of your own margin, the people who licensed you the name are collecting a fixed percentage off your top line, recession or not, good month or bad. And the spread between individual outcomes inside the exact same system is enormous. One Zips franchisee reported gross revenue of $2.15 million in a single year. Another, operating under the identical brand, the identical royalty rate, and the identical marketing contribution, reported $56,475. Both paid 6%. Both paid into the same national marketing fund. The system doesn't average your outcome out for you. It just takes its cut of whatever outcome you individually land on. For scale, Zips operates roughly 67 total locations nationwide, franchised and company-owned combined. Compare that to the 28,000 independent dry cleaners still running the old way. This industry, unlike gas stations or dental clinics, has not been meaningfully rolled up yet. That's not because private equity doesn't see the opportunity. It's because PERC liability sits on the balance sheet of every single acquisition target, and that liability is exactly the kind of thing that makes a roll-up firm's due diligence team very, very slow. Pricing itself splits the same way the ownership does. The traditional independent still prices per garment, anywhere from $6.50 to $20 a piece, depending on fabric and city. Zips built its entire growth story on breaking that model. One flat rate per item, same-day turnaround, an app that tells you when it's ready. It's a simpler promise to market, and it's exactly the kind of standardized, repeatable process that private equity likes to fund, because it scales the same way in Ohio as it does in Texas, while a family-run plant with its own pricing quirks and its own regulars does not. Volume is the number that actually separates a shop that survives from one that doesn't. A small operation processes roughly 200 to 300 garments a week, barely enough to cover the fixed cost of keeping a boiler running. A mid-sized shop handles 700 to 2,000 pieces. A large commercial operation, running multiple shifts and serving hotel and hospitality contracts, moves 2,000 to 4,000 plus garments weekly. Almost every fixed cost in this business, rent, insurance, a plant manager's salary, stays the same regardless of which of those three tiers you're in, which means the gap between barely surviving and comfortably profitable often comes down to whether you can fill the machine, not whether you can run it. Let's talk about how this actually ends for someone, because there's a fully documented case that shows exactly how thin the margin for error is in this business. Washington, D.C. Custom Cleaners. Run by Jin-Nam Chung and his wife, Sue Chung, South Korean immigrants who had built 3 separate dry cleaning stores across the city since arriving in the early 1990s. By any conventional measure, they were the success story this whole industry sells itself on. This isn't the only kind of collapse this industry produces, either. Not far away, in Albany, New York, a former dry cleaner called RKO Cleaners operated on Washington Avenue from 1964 until a fire in 2000 sent cleaning drums leaking into the ground. The last known owners couldn't even be located by the time the state stepped in. The property sat contaminated and abandoned until New York's Department of Environmental Conservation added it to the state's Superfund program in 2013 and eventually funded a $120,000 cleanup, paid entirely by taxpayers, more than a decade after the business itself had already vanished. Sometimes a dry cleaner doesn't collapse in a courtroom. It just quietly disappears, and the bill shows up on someone else's desk years later. May 2005. A customer named Roy Pearson, a local administrative law judge, drops off a pair of pants for alteration before starting a new job. The pants go missing or get mixed up with another customer's order for a matter of days before they're located. Here's the number that turns a lost pair of pants into a small business death sentence. Pearson sues the Chungs for $67 million. He later reduces the demand to $54 million, not for the pants themselves, for alleged violations of Washington, D.C.'s consumer protection statute, specifically over 2 signs hanging in the shop that read "Satisfaction Guaranteed" and "Same-Day Service," which Pearson argued were fraudulent and misleading. The case drags on for more than 2 years. The Chungs spend over $100,000 in legal fees defending it. In June 2007, the case finally goes to trial, and a D.C. Superior Court judge rules completely and unambiguously in the Chungs' favor. Pearson is awarded nothing, not a dollar. The trial itself became its own spectacle. Pearson represented parts of his own case, broke down in tears on the witness stand, and had to pause his own testimony to compose himself. It was covered by national outlets who had never written the words "dry cleaner" in a headline before and suddenly couldn't stop. They won. Read that number again, $54 million, and they won every single part of it. And 3 months later, September 19, 2007, the Chungs closed Custom Cleaners anyway. By that point, 2 of their 3 stores were already gone. Not because of a verdict against them, because 2+ years of legal fees, lost customers who assumed the worst, and unwanted national media attention had already done to the business what the lawsuit itself never legally managed to do. This is the actual shape of small business risk in this industry, and it doesn't always look like PERC sitting in the groundwater 20 years from now. Sometimes it looks like 1 customer, 1 pair of pants, and a consumer protection statute broad enough that a plaintiff can turn a made-up number into a national headline before a single fact has been proven in court. There's one detail that makes the whole case sting a little more. For part of the 2 years the lawsuit was active, Pearson reportedly kept bringing his own clothes back to Custom Cleaners anyway. It was the closest shop to his house. Pearson also filed an appeal after losing, dragging the Chungs back into a courtroom they thought they'd already left behind, into 2008. Their story ended up featured on a website called IamLawsuitAbuse.org, funded by the U.S. Chambers Institute for Legal Reform, which used the Chungs as the national face of frivolous litigation reform, a level of attention no dry cleaner ever plans for when they staple a paper tag to a customer's collar. The Chungs kept their third store, Happy Cleaners, and tried to rebuild slowly from there. But the lesson outlived the lawsuit. In an industry running on single-digit to low double-digit net margins, you don't need an industry-wide chemical ban to end a business. You need one bad Tuesday, a broadly written statute, and a plaintiff with more time on their hands than you have cash in the bank. So who actually wins in this industry over the long run? Not the plant owner absorbing whatever PERC liability is sitting under their own parking lot, discovered or not. Not the independent operator whose entire net worth is one broadly worded lawsuit away from custom cleaners' outcome. The winners, structurally, are the parties who never touch the solvent and never own the real estate underneath it. Procter & Gamble licenses the Tide name to Tide Cleaners franchisees and collects royalties on revenue it never had to generate itself, using a manufacturing and retail brand it had already built for an entirely different product category. JPB Capital Partners, the private equity fund behind Zips, doesn't operate a single press or staff a single counter. It owns the franchise system that collects 6% of gross sales from every location, plus a separate development fee for every new store that opens under the brand. Environmental consulting firms are a quieter version of the same story. The ones running Phase 1 and Phase 2 site assessments at $2,000 to $20,000 a project. The ones managing multi-year remediation contracts worth $500,000 to $3 million per contaminated site. Those firms have built a permanent, recurring revenue stream out of 60 years of an entire industry's chemical handling practices, a revenue stream that exists whether or not any individual dry cleaner ever turns a profit. State cleanup funds collect a tax on every gallon of solvent sold, whether or not that particular dry cleaner ever has an incident at all. The states that built these programs back in the 1990s, North Carolina, Oregon, and dozens of others, effectively created an insurance-like mechanism decades in advance, because the regulators writing those laws already knew this bill was coming for somebody. While the person standing behind the counter carries the chemical risk, the litigation risk, and the equipment risk personally, the brand owner, the private equity fund behind the franchise system, and the environmental remediation industry all collect a fee regardless of whether that particular shop survives the year. Compare the exposure to a business that looks superficially similar. A contaminated gas station site, dealing with a leaking underground fuel tank, typically closes out around $350,000, and in most states, a corrective action fund reimburses 75 to 90% of that, often bringing the owner's real out-of-pocket cost down to $20,000 to $75,000. A former dry cleaner, with PERC in the ground, runs $400,000 to $3 million in comparable situations, sometimes higher, with far thinner reimbursement infrastructure behind it in most states. Same category of small business. Same general size of storefront. A completely different order of magnitude in the risk sitting underneath it. There's a fourth winner, quieter than the rest. The insurance market that's grown up specifically to cover environmental liability at dry cleaning sites. Policies built around exactly this kind of contamination risk didn't exist in most states 40 years ago. Now they're a standard line item any broker will sell you the moment you mention you're buying a plant with a processing history, priced, of course, around the same uncertainty that's sitting under the parking lot you're about to lease. This isn't a story about a corrupt industry. It's a story about a very old, very ordinary structure repeating itself in a new sector. Whoever owns the license, the brand, and the liability shield gets paid first every single time. Whoever owns the storefront, the pressing machine, and the underlying dirt gets paid last, if there's anything left once everyone else has taken their cut. Which brings us back to the paper tag on your shirt collar. By roughly 2035, the chemical that has quietly driven this entire industry since the 1960s will be illegal to buy, sell, or use in a dry cleaning machine anywhere in the United States. Every one of the roughly 28,000 remaining dry cleaners in America now has a 10-year window to make a choice. Retrofit to a new, non-PERC solvent system, at a cost most independent owners cannot currently absorb without financing. or become one more entry in the number of businesses column that's already been shrinking for 5 straight years running. Some of them will convert and survive. Some will get bought by the roll-ups, the exact same way gas stations, dental practices, and veterinary clinics have already been bought before them. And some will simply close the way custom cleaners closed, not from one single catastrophic event you could point to on a map, but from a slow accumulation of costs and liabilities that nobody printed in the franchise brochure or the for sale listing. A few, like the site on Washington Avenue in Albany, won't close so much as fade out of business first and get discovered later once the state finally gets around to testing the soil. So here's the question this industry leaves you with, and it comes in 2 halves. Every roll-up story on this channel starts the same way. An ordinary local business, fragmented across tens of thousands of independent owners, sitting on a structural risk most of those owners never fully priced in. Dry cleaning fits that pattern almost perfectly, except here, the fragmentation itself has been the thing keeping the roll-ups out. Nobody wants to buy 28,000 small balance sheets when a meaningful number of them might be sitting on a 6-figure environmental surprise. That hesitation won't last forever. A federal deadline has a way of forcing consolidation that pure economics couldn't. Is this a fading trade you'd be inheriting on its way toward the exit? Or a market that's about to clear itself of everyone who can't afford the transition, leaving real room for whoever is patient enough and capitalized enough to survive it? And the next time you pick up your own clothes, and that little paper tag gets stapled to the hanger without a second thought from either of you, do you actually know whose balance sheet just got a little bit heavier because of it? Yours or somebody else's?